over the next few weeks, I think it's going to be chalk city for me personally, betting on the UFC. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, what chalk or betting chalk basically means in sports betting is betting on big favourites. And if you've been watching my content for a while, most of you have, you'll know that generally I don't like to bet big favourites in MMA because it's a crazy, unpredictable, chaotic sport. You know, we saw last weekend with our bet on Michel Pereira. He was nowhere near as aggressive as he usually is. He just didn't show up. And while we predicted that Magomedov wouldn't be able to have success with his wrestling correctly, unfortunately Pereira barely did anything for 2 rounds of the fight, started super slow and set fire to our money. Now, that's not uncommon in the UFC. Unfortunately, one of the most difficult aspects of pre-fight betting is that quite frequently fighters will either show up and look nothing like they have done in the past, or they will use a different game plan and strategy than what would be logical to give them the best chance of winning, or their opponent shows up and looks a lot better than before. That's why my speciality is live betting, and we've been able to have so much success over the years live betting on the UFC, because with live betting you can see exactly what you're getting for your money before you put your money at risk. Like, the way that I would describe like live betting on the UFC versus pre-fight betting on the UFC would be, if you think about purchasing a t-shirt in a store versus online. You can look at a picture of a t-shirt online and the colours might be vibrant on the print. The t-shirt may look like it's got a great fit and the materials are really high quality. And then we've always all been in that situation where the t-shirt arrives in the post. The print is kind of dull and the colours aren't exactly what they look like in the picture. The quality of the material, the fabric isn't as good. The fit is a little bit weird. And had we seen that item in the flesh, we obviously wouldn't have bought it because it wasn't what we expected it to be. With live betting, it's like going into a store and actually seeing the t-shirt in front of you, being able to see the colours, feel the material with your own hands. You know exactly what you're getting. When you purchase that t-shirt, you know exactly what you're getting. Now, it doesn't mean when you go home and you wash it for the first time, it doesn't shrink and the ink runs off, because, you know what I mean, nothing in life is certain. But when you actually feel that t-shirt up close, you can see what you're getting for your money. You can feel the quality. That's why live betting is far superior to pre-fight betting, and that's why, you know, our performance on live betting is a lot better than pre-fight betting over the long term. We're still profitable on pre-fight betting, don't get me wrong. If we go here and look at our profitability charts, this is our profitability chart on live betting when it loads. Nice, steady, consistent uptrend over the long term. Absolutely beautiful. And we're in the middle of a very nice uptrend at the moment, about to take another big leg up. But you can see our pre-fight betting profitability chart is fraught with crazy variance, crazy dips. One here, one here, one here, one here. We're in the middle of one here. But as you can see, over the long term, dating back over the last 12 years, we always bounce back strong. And we're very, very consistently profit over the long term. But the chaos, the unpredictable nature of the UFC, of mixed martial arts, is the reason why I don't like to bet on big favourites in the UFC, because you never know when they may show up and look totally different to how they've looked in past fights, or when their opponents look a lot better than you expect them to. So, over the next few weeks, we've got some of those rare examples coming up where we've got really big favourites that do fit my criteria of being bettable, because I feel we've got a lot of big favourites coming up that, unless something totally crazy happens, they've got almost no way to lose. So in those circumstances, even though they are big favourites, I still see value there. So you've probably seen the thumbnail, you've probably seen the title. Obviously, I am going to be betting Corey Sandhagen and Bo Nickal this weekend, who are pretty big favourites. I've got some other bets on this card as well. And in this video, we're going to be explaining the reasons why. Let's kick things off by starting off with the main event, which is going to be Corey Sandhagen versus Davison Figueiredo. Now, I've got to be honest with you, I am a bit surprised Sandhagen's not a bigger favourite here, because you regularly see these days the MMA betting market throw out very extreme odds on very low level fighters. We see fighters 1.10 minus 1000 all the time these days. And yet in this instance, where you've got very high level fighter in Corey Sandhagen fighting a guy that's a lot smaller than him, way past his prime in Deiveson Figueiredo, he's only 1.20, which obviously is minus 500 for an implied probability of 83%. So even though 83% is a pretty steep implied probability to apply to any fighter in the UFC, this is one of those situations where I do think there's value in Sandhagen. I would cap him above 90% in terms of his chances of winning this fight. So if we start off by looking at the tail of the tape, I guess we should pop Figgy's odds in as well. So he's around the 4.70, which is going to be plus 370 underdog for an implied probability of 21%. If we start off by taking a look at the tail of the tape, this is where the reasons start for the reasons why I like Sandhagen. So we can see that Figueiredo is 37 years old, 5'5" with a 68-inch reach. And we can see that Sandhagen, 33 years old, 5'11" with a 70-inch reach. So we can see a bit of a reach advantage for Sandhagen. 2 inches isn't substantial. But we can see he's a lot bigger than Figueiredo. And I expect this to be one of those situations where the size difference between these two at the ceremonial weigh-ins on Friday is probably going to be comical. I would expect to see an enormous size difference between these two. Figueiredo is also very old for a bantamweight. We know that the lighter weight classes, tend to decline earlier in their careers. So 37 years old for a bantamweight is more like 40 years old plus in a heavier weight class, like light heavyweight. So we know Figueiredo is going to be declining a lot from fight to fight. We're seeing that in his recent performances. It's one of the main reasons why he moved from flyweight to bantamweight, because the weight cut was getting difficult for him at flyweight, which indicates that his body is changing. And with Sandhagen, even though, to be fair, he is starting to get a little old for a bantamweight at 33 years old, the difference between 33 and 37 in the bantamweight division is substantial. Sandhagen's still close to his athletic prime. Figueiredo way past it. So, in terms of how these two match up stylistically, I think Sandhagen is better than Deiveson Figueiredo in every single aspect of MMA. I can't think of a single thing that Figueiredo does better than Sandhagen, and that is one of the reasons why I'm betting on Sandhagen this weekend. So Sandhagen's significantly better striker, throws a more diverse range of strikes, a higher volume of strikes, far more technical than Figgy. Figgy tends to load up on big singular power shots, but cannot match the volume or the technique of Sandhagen. And I also think, especially with the size difference, I think Corey Sandhagen is a significantly better MMA grappler as well. We saw in his fight against Umar Nurmagomedov that he's incredibly difficult to take down, incredibly difficult to hold down. And Umar Nurmagomedov is one of the best MMA grapplers in the history of the bantamweight division. If he wasn't able to have much success taking down Sandhagen and holding him down, I very much doubt that a 37-year-old Deiveson Figueiredo, who's given up a massive size disadvantage, is going to have much success. So the only ways that I see Sandhagen losing this, now obviously MMA is a crazy sport, anything can happen, but the only ways that I would really see Sandhagen losing this is something crazy, like he significantly underperforms and has a bad weight cut, or comes in with an injury, or has a staph infection or something like that. It's not stuff we can account for in betting on the UFC, unfortunately. It's just the risk of the game. Or he gets disqualified, or he just gets caught with a big shot and knocked down, and Figueiredo jumps on a guillotine or something, or takes his back, chokes him out, or just straight up knocks him out. I don't think that's that likely though, because Sandhagen has shown that he has very good striking defense, and he is incredibly tough, incredibly durable. If we look at his record, we can see that he's never been knocked out. So he has had 23 pro fights, he's never been knocked out. He's only been finished one time by Aljamain Sterling, which is also pretty impressive, and he's fought some big power punches. So we know Marlon Vera is dangerous on the feet, Song has big power, Jan's dangerous on the feet, he went to a decision with him. Marlon Moraes back in 2020 was very dangerous on the feet. John Lineker was a big power puncher. and despite all this, no one's been able to knock him out. Will Figueiredo be the first to do it? It's possible, but Figueiredo is a 37-year-old flyweight. I just feel it's pretty unlikely. And if you look at Figueiredo's record, it's been a long time since he knocked someone out. He hasn't knocked someone out since he fought, I would say, even though he kind of submitted Benavidez, that was more of a knockout because of how many times he wobbled Benavidez in that fight. So I would say you've got to go back 5 years almost to the last time Figueiredo knocked someone out. So obviously the odds suggest Sandhagen's got huge advantages in this fight. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but this is one of those situations where I do think a big favourite is bettable. So I'm happy to throw Sandhagen into a parlay with Bo Nickal this weekend, and we'll talk about the reasons why in a moment when we move on to the Bo Nickal fight. But yeah, let's take a look at the over-under on this one. So in terms of the over-under, I am actually pretty tempted to bet on under 4.5 rounds at these underdog odds, just because I just have a feeling that these guys are in the stage of their careers where Figueiredo's going to find it very hard to go 5 hard rounds with a high volume striker like Sandhagen. Sandhagen's a lot bigger than Brandon Moreno. He hits a lot harder. He's aggressive, and he does fight with a chip on his shoulder at times. I think we may see Sandhagen come in, look to make a statement this weekend, be very aggressive and inflict a lot of damage on Figueiredo, like we saw him inflict on Yadong Song back in 2022. Just have a feeling that Figueiredo may be in for a tough night here, and I think it's quite likely it will reach a point in this fight where Figueiredo may become too tired to defend himself, and then Sandhagen can get a finish just through breaking him down with volume. So I do quite like fight doesn't go to decision. I'm very tempted to bet that. In terms of most likely outcomes for the props, I do think the most likely outcome is Sandhagen wins by knockout or TKO. So if you're into your prop betting, I would take a look at that as well. That's something that I would strongly consider. Because I think Sandhagen's also the kind of guy that if Figgy was very tired, he would favour trying to get a stoppage with ground and pound as opposed to a submission. That's kind of on brand for Sandhagen. Has he ever submitted anyone? One time, a very long time ago. 2 times, a very long time ago. So not in recent history. So I hope you found that useful. So now let's explain the reasons why I think Bo Nickal is also a very good bet this week. And I'm going to use a little bit of footage to illustrate the reasons why. It is also worth noting at this point that Bo's odds have declined a decent amount since I recommended betting him to the members of my community about 5 days ago. So it's the 30th of April now. I recommended betting Bo and Corey last Friday. So let's see what the average odds on a parlay for them would be now. So we were able to get 1.69 minus 145 a week ago. So now if you were to do it, average odds about 1.20, average odds on Bo about 1.30. Fucking hell, those odds have declined a lot. Those odds have declined a lot. Those odds have actually declined a lot. 1.69 minus 145 down to 1.56. Which is minus 179. I don't like that anywhere near as much. So I am very happy that we were able to get in at better odds on this. If you're watching this on YouTube, would I recommend this bet now? It's tough. It's tough at those odds. In the even money odds range, I think you're getting a good risk to reward ratio. At close to minus 200, you're going to have to make a personal decision on this one, boys. I think the value may be gone. And we may have this crop up a few times over the next few weeks because, like I say, I'm basically putting bets out to my community a week before the fight takes place. So I think we've placed about 4 or 5 money line bets in the last 2 to 3 weeks. And I think the odds have declined on 3 of the 5 money line bets. The odds on Michelle Pereira stayed the same. The odds on... Who was it? The odds on Michael Chandler improved, but the odds on Alexander Volkanovski declined. The odds on Bryce Mitchell declined quite a lot, actually. I think we bet Mitchell at 3.10 plus 210. I think the closing line was 2.50 plus 150, which is a huge move. We beat the closing line by quite a bit there. And then the third bet where the odds declined was Randy Brown last week. We bet Randy Brown when he was 1.40 minus 250, and I think he closed about 1.30 minus 333. So yeah, we're beating the closing line, just acting a week sooner quite frequently, and that's quite a big dip. And you can see, so we placed this bet on the 25th. If we look at the odds movement on Sandhagen, where are we? So the 25th is here. Where are we? April. Wait a minute, am I going crazy? Where's April 25th? Oh, we can't go on April 25th. See the 26th or the 1st. Okay, so, alright, so on the 26th, he was 1.22 on average, which is about a 10% dip from his average odds now. Which, when you're dealing with parlays, it can influence the multiplier a bit. And then if we take a look at Bo Nickal's odds on the 25th, he was around 1.35. So yeah, he's dropped a decent amount as well. So that's where the odds have declined combined about 7 points on Sandhagen and Nickal, which is why there's a difference in the odds. Alright, you have to make a decision on that based on what I'm about to go through. So anyway, Reina de Ridder, 34 years old, 6'4" with a 78-inch reach. Bo Nickal, 29 years old, 6'1" with a 76-inch reach. So both guys are about the same age, about the same size. Obviously, Nickal's a lot younger than de Ridder, but in the scope of this fight, 35 years old isn't really a big deal. Reina de Ridder, a little bit longer and a little bit taller. So when we were breaking down the Corey Sandhagen, Davison Figueiredo fight, I was saying this is one of those situations where I'm surprised Sandhagen isn't a bigger favourite, because we see these days on UFC cards fighters who are much lower level than both Bo Nickal and Corey Sandhagen being blessed with like 1.10 odds. I know Jacqueline Amarin was dominant last week against Polyana Viana, but should she really be a 1.10 favourite against any able-bodied athlete in the UFC? I'm not so sure. So I think Bo Nickal is another case of a fighter that should be a far bigger favourite here, and I'm not surprised to see his odds decline. The reason why I think there was a bit of extra value in his odds is I know a lot of people that bet this sport wiki cap it. So if you were just wiki capping this fight, looking at their records, you'd be like, oh, okay, de Ridder's on a 3-fight winning streak. He submitted Gerald Meerschaert and Kevin Holland in his last 2. That's cool. And then in your mind, you're probably thinking Paul Craig's a low-level fighter. And Bo Nickal looked terrible against him in his last fight. So that's probably where the extra value in Bo has come from, is recency bias. But if we just drown all the noise out and focus on what is true, focus on how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, it's a very, very good stylistic matchup for Bo Nickal. Now, on the feet, both guys are pretty sloppy. Both of them have bad defense. They're wild, they're reckless. Both these guys very, very low level when it comes to striking. But both these guys are primarily grapplers, so you would expect this fight to be decided by grappling. If Bo Nickal did put in a weird performance like he did against Paul Craig and choose to try and stand and strike to showcase his striking instead of just taking Craig down and making the fight easy, if he did do that, I still think he would beat de Ridder, because de Ridder's cardio is very bad. If you take a look at his fights against Gerald Meerschaert, Anatoly Malakin, any of his fights that go past round 1, essentially, he slows down, gas is pretty bad, he's very, very sloppy on the feet. So we saw, Bo Nickal, good cardio against Craig, didn't slow, even though he's sloppy on the feet. Still think he has the advantage over de Ridder. However, when it comes to grappling, Bo Nickal levels and levels and levels and levels and levels and levels and levels above de Ridder. These guys are in different galaxies. These guys are in different universes when it comes to grappling. De Ridder, even though he's got 2 submissions in his last 2 fights, very, very, very low level grappler. Like, these two are not close on the ground. So if Bo Nickal comes into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, if at any point in this fight these guys decide to grapple, DeRidder is absolutely cooked. He's going to be in a lot of trouble. I just quickly want to show you a little bit of footage of his fight against Gerald Meerschaert to show this. We'll quickly skim through, and I don't want to make this breakdown video super long, so we're not going to be going further back in DeRidder's career to show you how bad he's looked on the ground in other fights. But trust me, if you go watch his fights against like Malakin, you will see him make all the same mistakes that we saw him make in the Gerald Meerschaert fight. And so, yeah, go do your own research if you need further confirmation, or just take my word for it. So we're just going to skim through, and what we're going to focus on is looking at how bad DeRidder's cardio is. And again, he slows down in all of his fights to go past round 1. And we're going to focus on his grapplings. That's where we expect this fight to be decided. So here you can see DeRidder hits the takedown. Very nice. But then he kind of postures up, gives Meerschaert the space to pop back up to his feet, tries to jump back on top of Meerschaert, winds up losing the scramble, getting reversed, ends up on the bottom. Now, for someone like Bo Nickal, such a high-level MMA grappler, you just can't afford to be making these kind of mistakes against him. We'll keep scrolling. We will keep scrolling. And you can already see in this first round, actually, DeRidder's starting to look tired and sloppy. We'll just skip through. Like I say, I'm going to try and keep this breakdown as short as possible. Laboured, predictable takedown entry there from DeRidder. Here's another takedown entry. Nice deep entry. But Meerschaert essentially pulls guard on a guillotine. And then Meerschaert pops back up to his feet very, very easily. Again, DeRidder shoots back in. Meerschaert attacks with a guillotine. DeRidder gives up on it. This way you can start to see DeRidder start to look very sloppy, very slow on the feet. You can see very sloppy. And don't get me wrong, Nickal's striking is not great either. They're both very bad on the feet. But the difference between Nickal and DeRidder is that DeRidder is tired and sloppy and laboured, whereas Nickal, even though he's reckless, he has very good cardio. So he still has pop in his shots, still has energy, things like that. So you can see big visible deep breath here. Watch the body language of DeRidder. Big visible deep breath. Big visible deep breath there. And so signs just in 5 minutes that DeRidder is starting to slow. If we scroll through, which is a bit of a paradox because he was able to submit Meerschaert in round 3, but again, MMA is a crazy, chaotic, unpredictable sport, and we have to cut through all the bullshit, focus on what is true. That's why over the long term we've been able to consistently grind out profits most months, and yeah, produce the kind of profitability over the long term that perhaps no one else in the world has been able to achieve over such a long period. Don't know if anyone else has been in the game as long as me. So into round 2 now. If we go to round 2, takedown entry here from DeRidder. Now he's going to be looking a little bit fresher at the beginning of round 2 because he's just had a minute to recover in between rounds. But even here you can see at the beginning of this round, watch him take a deep breath here. In through the nose, out through the mouth. You know what I mean? Very flat. We're only like 20 seconds into round 2. But we want to focus on the grappling positions. So he walks Meerschaert over to the cage. Hits a very cheap outside trip. So he's in half guard. And we'll just scroll through half guard. Beating Meerschaert up from half guard. And then you can see Meerschaert gets to his knees. And in another very lazy, sloppy, tired choke attempt from DeRidder. And he's fucking giving up position. He's flopping to his back. Like, he's dreadful, man. And then on his back you can see Meerschaert holds him down. Beats him up from top position. You can see DeRidder's very weak off his back. When did he hit the ground? So he hit the ground at about 3 minutes 10 seconds left to go in round 2. And if we skip through, so he's been on the ground for 2 minutes at this point, and then Meerschaert just essentially lets him back up, gives him loads of space off his back after about 2 minutes to stand back up, which is bad fight IQ from Meerschaert, but I wouldn't expect nothing else from Gerald. Then another lazy outside trip attempt from De Ridder, somehow gets it. Tangle of legs, but very laboured, end the round in a dominant position. Then into round 3, into the third, scrolling through, sloppy takedown attempt from Meerschaert. Sloppy outside trip from fucking De Ridder. This is like watching, you know, I'm not going to say what this is like watching, but this is some low-level stuff, far below the level of Bo Nickal. We shall say that. We shall say that. That is fair for us to say. Sloppy choke attempt from De Ridder, but Meerschaert now suddenly looks tired, flopping to his back, all that kind of stuff. Sloppy, sloppy, sloppy. If you're fighting someone like Bo Nickal, he's just going to get to the body lock in a position like this, ragdoll you to your back and just beat you up from top position. Like, De Ridder is only getting away with looking terrible on the ground because Meerschaert's imploding here, making a lot of mistakes, and he's gassing out of nowhere, which is a little bit surprising because Meerschaert, you know, usually has pretty good cardio. How often have we seen Meerschaert struggle in fights, hang in there, drag guys into deep water and get a third round finish? De Ridder Meerschaert in this one, which was interesting. I actually thought the way this fight was going, I actually thought that Meerschaert was going to be the one submitting De Ridder late on. In fact, I live bet Meerschaert in this fight at underdog odds. I was already counting my profits and gutted to see him implode in the third like that. That's the way it goes. That's why they call it gambling. You gotta be comfortable with taking L's like that, or you'll never make any money. Certainly will never produce a chart that looks as good as this. So into the reasons why I like Nickal, just to summarize: better cardio, better striking, better grappling, levels above De Ridder everywhere. This does fit the profile of a big favourite. I do think it warrants a bet in some capacity, even though obviously his odds have declined now. So in terms of the over-under on this one, it's tricky to predict the over and under because we don't know what version of Nickal we're going to get. If he fucks around like he did against Paul Craig and chooses to stand and strike, then I could see this fight go into a decision and being a very ugly, sloppy, you know, low-level stand-up fight. If Bo Nickal comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, I think De Ridder is absolutely screwed. I think Nickal will wear him down with far superior grappling and will eventually get a stoppage either through submission and ground and pound or ground and pound. So without knowing what game plan and strategy Nickal's coming in with, how much grappling he plans to use, or if he's going to try and showcase his striking again like he did against Craig, difficult to go either way. Personally, Bo Nickal took such criticism after the Paul Craig fight. I do think he's probably going to want to come out and make a statement, and the best way to do that is going back to his bread and butter, which is grappling. So if he does do that, I think that you will see Bo Nickal end up submitting De Ridder or stopping him with ground and pound. So my lean would be on the fight doesn't go to a decision, but I wouldn't bet it personally. Odds are too steep. So most likely outcome on this, Nickal by knockout or TKO. Obviously I don't expect him to knock De Ridder out on the feet, but a stoppage for ground and pound would classify as knockout or TKO. Odds are too short on that. Nickal by submission, getting a little bit more interesting to me. I would look at perhaps betting Nickal in round 2 or 3. What are the odds on that? Nickal wins in round 1 or 2. Shockingly bad odds. Nickal wins in round... Where are we? Here we go. Nickal wins in round 2. 5.5 plus 450 on average. Not great. Nickal wins in round 3. Not great. Yeah, the odds are too short. I would give it a miss. Hopefully the parlay comes through for us. Fingers crossed. And it's a shame the odds have declined. The value's gone. And I've already got some bets for next week's card, and I think the odds are going to decline on them as well. I don't want to just talk about the bet yet on YouTube, so I don't want the odds to decline in case any of my members haven't got in yet, but I do think it will be fruitful for us to start placing these bets early, because we are beating the closing line often. We haven't beat on our last 5 bets. We've only not beat the closing line on one fighter, and that was Michael Chandler. The Pereira fight, the odds stayed pretty much the same. But like I say, we beat the closing line big time on Bryce Mitchell, Randy Brown and Alexander Volkanovski. So hopefully that's a positive sign that we're going to hit this parlay on Sandhagen and Nickal. So yeah, hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Daniel Rodriguez. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Ponzinibbio is the slight favourite at average odds of about 1.83, which is going to be minus 120 for an implied probability of 55%. And if we take a look at the odds on Rodriguez, he's around an average of 1.98, which is going to be minus 102 for an implied probability of 51%. So Ponzinibbio is 38 years old, 6 foot tall with a 73-inch reach. Rodriguez is 38 years old, 6'1" with a 74-inch reach. So both guys about the same age, about the same size, and both of them are on a very steep decline. But I like the matchmaking here. I really appreciate it when the UFC match fighters up like this, because I hate how they always tend to match veterans up against the young hungry bulls, like they did with Zhang versus Anthony Smith last week, and then the young hungry bull just comes out, murders the old vet, makes them look terrible, and tarnishes their legacy. I like it when they match veterans up against veterans. It's a fair fight. So kudos to the UFC for this fight. Great matchmaking. I wish they would do this kind of thing more often. Nobody wants to see Ponzinibbio or Rodriguez matched up against a 27, 28-year-old kid who's going to kill them. So all things being equal here on the tail of the tape, both these guys are still declining, but in very, very different ways. So with Ponzinibbio, the way he's declining is that his durability has left the building. He cannot take a shot anymore. So whilst his cardio is still good, his output is still very good, he's still tough as nails, and he's very technical, he just can't take a shot anymore like he used to. So where we talked last week about Carlos Prates, being a high pressure fighter that forces his opponents to engage and as a result will take damage and take shots in return, Ponzinibbio built a career in exactly the same way. On the front foot, aggressive, taking control of the centre of the octagon and crowding his opponents with relentless pressure. Because of that, he took a lot of damage in his career, and fighters that have the kind of style that Ponzinibbio has do tend to have quite a rough and steep decline. We've seen it in Tony Ferguson, we've seen it in Nate Diaz, we've seen it in Masvidal, we've seen it in Nick Diaz. We'll probably see it in Carlos Prates in his late 30s, and we're certainly seeing it in Santiago Ponzinibbio. So he just can't take a shot anymore. That might not matter this weekend though, because Rodriguez has never really been a power puncher. If you look at his record, the last time he knocked someone out was 4 years ago against Preston Parsons, and he's only got 2 wins by knockout in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 UFC fights. So not great for a striker. And Rodriguez has always been more of a volume striker. So even though Ponzinibbio is fragile these days, he can't take a shot like he used to. Rodriguez might not be the kind of guy that could expose that. Whereas even though Rodriguez is a higher level striker than Carlston Harris, who was able to rock and drop and wobble Ponzinibbio multiple times in this fight, Harris has more raw power than Rodriguez does. So Rodriguez very much a volume striker, but this is where the decline in Rodriguez starts to manifest itself, because Rodriguez throws much lower volume than he did just a few years ago, and at this stage in Rodriguez's career he's quite passive, quite tentative, doesn't really do very much. And this is a symptom of decline we often see in aging fighters. We saw it in Anderson Silva, we saw it in Lyoto Machida, we saw it in Robbie Lawler, where you get these guys that usually throw a decent volume of strikes, and then as they decline, they get older, they become very gun shy. It's almost like they're slightly off the pace. They still see the opportunities to throw the shot, but by the time they register, their brain's connection to their hand to throw the punch, the opportunity's gone, and so they end up throwing nothing, and they almost look frozen in there. We're very much seeing that from Rodriguez, whereas Ponzinibbio is still very aggressive, still throws a high volume of strikes. So this is one of those matchups where I would lean towards Ponzinibbio, because he still has the technique, still has the volume, is still aggressive. He just hasn't got the chin and the durability anymore. But because he's facing a guy in Rodriguez that doesn't throw much, doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes, and has never been a power puncher, is not particularly dangerous. I know power is the last thing to go, but Rodriguez has never been that dangerous on the feet for me. That means Ponzinibbio is more likely to win here, because he's facing someone that could exploit Ponzinibbio's main weakness these days, which is his durability, but is not that well equipped to, because he just doesn't have much power, and he never has. So my lean would be Ponzinibbio on this one, but I don't really have much of a desire to bet on 37, 38-year-old fighters. For me, when you bet on fighters at this stage in their careers, you know, we saw it with Michael Chandler a few weeks ago, who looked far worse than he did in his last fight in November 2024 against Charles Oliveira. Whenever you bet on fighters at this stage in their career, you are inviting losses, you are inviting variance, and it's quite often not a smart thing to do, because you don't know the rate at which these two guys are declining. You don't know any injuries, you know, long-term injuries they're dealing with that could affect their performance, and so risky to bet on guys when they're this age. You know, we frequently talk about how fighters quite often show up and don't look anything like they have done in the past. That's one of the biggest contributing reasons to losses we take in pre-fight bets, so we can significantly reduce the number of losses that we take on pre-fight bets by not putting our money on fighters where we know the chances of them looking totally different to before are higher. So yeah, I'm going to pass on this one, but my lean would be Ponzinibbio. If we take a look at the over-under, I do think this fight is quite likely to go deep. The odds reflect that. The odds are pretty steep on the fight to go to a decision. This is because Daniel Rodriguez has always been tough and durable. I know he's starting to be finished a couple times in his last few fights, but he still looks durable to me. He's always been durable. He's always been tough. It's not going to be easy for Pons to get him out of there. And like I said, Pons can't take a shot anymore, but Rodriguez likely doesn't have the power to deliver the shot that would hurt him anyway. So I won't be betting that. The odds are too steep, but I certainly wouldn't be betting on this fight not to go to a decision. In terms of the prop bets, the only one I would consider would be Ponzinibbio by decision, but the odds are terrible, so that is a very easy pass from me. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Daniel Marcos versus Montel Jackson. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see the Montel Jackson is the favourite at average odds of around 1.48, which is going to be minus 208 for an implied probability of 68%. And if we take a look at the odds on his opponent, where are you, Mr. Marcos? There he is. He's around an average of 2.65, which is going to be plus 165 for an implied probability of 38%. So Jackson, 33 years old, 5'10" with a 75-inch reach. And Marcos is 32 years old, 5'7" with a 69-inch reach. So we can see Montel Jackson has a very big size and reach advantage over Marcos. And you would expect these guys to look at least a weight class apart at the ceremonial weigh-ins on Friday. We know size matters in MMA. We have weight classes for a reason. That does give Jackson a very big edge over the undefeated Marcos at 17-0. I couldn't believe Marcos was undefeated. He's very good. Is he good enough to be undefeated? I'm not so sure. We're going to find out on Saturday. But anyway, in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, Daniel Marcos was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet this weekend, because at underdog odds I thought, you know what, Montel Jackson has demonstrated some inconsistency, some bad fight IQ. You know, his performance against Brett Johns was dreadful, where he basically imploded and just didn't show up. So whenever you've got a fighter that is inconsistent like Jackson, I always look for opportunities to bet against them. And Marcos is very consistent. So we've got a consistent guy like Marcos, where you know exactly what to expect from them, and they're at underdog odds against an inconsistent guy like Montel Jackson. It's worth sometimes taking a gamble on the inconsistent fighter just not showing up on the night, like we saw when he fought Brett Johns. But obviously that fight was a long time ago, going back 5 years, and we've seen him fight 5 times since then. This fight is a very difficult one to predict because it's tough to know where Montel Jackson is at in 2025. If you look at his record, his last 2 fights have ended very quickly in the first round, so they don't really tell us anything. So you've got to go all the way back to 2022 for his fights against JP Buys and Julio Arte to get a good look at Montel Jackson. And obviously a lot can change since then. He could look a lot better since then. He could look a lot worse. Jackson could be world championship caliber at this point, or the inconsistency and bad fight IQ that has plagued him in some of his past fights could still be present. I don't think the 4 or 5 fights that he's had since the Brett Johns matchup really answer that definitively either way. For that reason, it will always be a risk from me to bet on Montel Jackson until a good amount of time has passed since the Brett Johns fight, where he's faced a good level of opponent in fights that have lasted a good amount of time for us to then say, okay, he's put those demons behind him. He fights a lot smarter now, and this is the guy that we can start to trust at favourite odds. But I don't have that at this point, so there's no way that I would bet an inconsistent fighter like Jackson in this odds range. An implied probability of 68% just makes him unbettable. To get any value here, you've got to give Jackson a better than 70% chance of winning. And when we're dealing with inconsistent fighters, that's never going to be the case if you understand probability. So straight away, a bet on Jackson is off the table. And then we've just got to consider whether Daniel Marcos is worth a bet. So, like I say, Marcos was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet this week because he's aggressive, high volume striker, very technical. And I thought, if Jackson does have an off night, Marcos could be able to out-hustle him and outwork him on the feet, which he still can. That's a possibility. But after researching this one, watching Marcos' recent fights, I wound up liking him a lot less than I thought I would. So if you go back and watch his last 2 fights against John Castaneda and Adrian Yanez, what you'll actually see is that Marcos actually slows down in both fights quite a lot. I wouldn't go as far as to say he gasses, but he definitely becomes noticeably flatter, noticeably slower in the second half of those fights. And that impacts his striking defense and the volume of strikes that he throws. And as a result, Marcos is kind of a tough guy to trust now this weekend as well, because we know Montel Jackson is a very high level grappler. He was an alternate on the United States Olympic wrestling team. Jackson prefers the stand and strike. We don't see him grapple that often, but we know it's there if he needs it. And while Marcos' takedown offense and ground game is not bad, it obviously isn't going to be anywhere near the level of Montel Jackson's. So this is one of those matchups where Montel Jackson has a lot of advantages. He probably has better cardio. He's got a huge size advantage. He's definitely a better grappler. And I can't necessarily say he's a better striker than Marcos because they both have very different styles of striking. Marcos is a high volume striker that likes to build in a lot of leg kicks and jabs, whereas Jackson more of a lower volume single shot sniper. But Jackson does have more raw power and he's very technical on the feet. Jackson's got all the skills required to be a champion in this division, and I don't use those words lightly. You very rarely hear me talk about a fighter in that context. But remember when he first came into the UFC, this is a guy with an Olympic level wrestling background, knockout power, great cardio. He's got the perfect frame for the division. He's long and tall, he's rangy, he's got technical striking. Just that Brett Johns performance bothers me. Hope I'm wrong about this guy. I hope he was injured or something in that fight, and when we see him fight more to his full potential, the guy will be an absolute beast. But yeah, he's 33 years old, he doesn't have time on his side, but very high level. And it's a tough test against Daniel Marcos this weekend. We'll see how he does. So I'm going to pass on this one. I'll save this one for live betting. Hopefully we can make some money on it in live betting, but pre-fight betting is very difficult. The Brett Johns fight makes me not want to bet Montel Jackson ever at an implied probability of 70%, but because Jackson has so many advantages, I wouldn't want to take Marcos as a slight underdog either. So in terms of the over-under on this fight, we can see fight goes to decision, pretty steep favourite odds. I would agree, fight is more likely to go to a decision because both guys are tough. Marcos is very tough, he won't be easy to put away. The odds are way too steep on that for me to bet, though. The only prop I would consider would be Jackson by decision. The odds are absolutely dreadful, so I would give them a miss. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Cameron Smotherman versus Sergey Sidey. And what the hell have we got going on with this profile pic? Joe, what do you think of this profile pic? Oh my god, indeed. What the fuck is going on here, boys? What is going on? This should have a fucking... this should have like one of those things where when you go on the web page, it should come up and say, before you can access this page, are you over 18? What the fuck is going on with this? Anyway, Smotherman, who has a far more family-friendly profile pic, and Sergey Sidey. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Smotherman is the slight underdog at average odds of about, we'll say, 2.12, which is going to be plus 112 for an implied probability of 47%. And if we take a look at the odds on Mr. Sidey, he's around an average of 1 point, quite a big odds spread actually. We'll say 1.75, which is going to be minus 133 for an implied probability of 57%. So Smotherman is 27 years old, 5'9" with a 69-inch reach, and Sidey is 28 years old, 5'11" with a 72-inch reach. So even though on paper doesn't look like much of a size difference between these two, their body types are very different. So Sergey Sidey is a long, tall, rangy Muay Thai fighter, throws a lot of kicks, uses his length well, and you know, is just a long fighter. So even though he's only 2 inches taller than Smotherman and only has a 3-inch reach, he's long, he's rangy. Smotherman, on the other hand, has a more smaller, compact, muscular frame, very heavy boxing style, loads up on boxing, and you know, very different body types. And both guys play to the strengths of their body type, with Smotherman being a more power punching boxer, Sidey using that length, that ranginess with kicks and jabs and stuff with a base in Muay Thai. So how do these two match up from a stylistic point of view? Well, both guys are primarily strikers. You don't see either of them try to take their opponents down that often, so I would expect this to be a stand-up fight. Can't rule out there being any grappling, but we don't know a whole lot about the grappling between these two. Like I say, they both like to stand and strike. If you look at Smotherman's record, most of his wins inside the distance are by knockout. He's only got one win by submission. And Sidey, if you look at his record, similar sort of story really. Bunch of wins due to punches and knockouts and ground and pound and all things like that. So, should be a stand-up fight. Very much a clash of styles when it comes to striking. And for me, this is a very difficult one to predict, because if I just look at the technique that both guys have displayed in past fights, I lean towards Smotherman, because for me, he is the more... I don't even know how I'm going to word this. Smotherman in past fights is better defensively, hits harder, and has tighter boxing technique. So when you are analysing the way both these guys match up in terms of technique, what you see from Sidey is him taking a lot of damage in fights, being kind of reckless, not the best defensively, and eating a lot of clean, hard shots. And because Smotherman hits hard and he's a very technical boxer and he's got good enough cardio to go hard for 3 rounds, there's a pretty good chance that this fight is going to look a whole lot like Sergey Sidey's fight against Rahman Tavares. Both of his fights against Rahman Tavares, he was actually struggling before he knocked Tavares out, which is why they did a rematch of this fight, and Tavares then won the rematch. But Smotherman, in my opinion, is as good of a boxer as both Garrett Armfield and Ramon Tavares, and so as a result, if those two guys had a lot of success boxing against Sidey, it is reasonable for us to assume Smotherman will as well. The problem with betting this fight pre-fight, and why this fight is much better to stick to live betting on, is Sidey is battle tested. So we've seen Sidey in two extremely tough fights against Garrett Armfield and Ramon Tavares, two fights that were contested at a super high pace, and he took a lot of damage in both those fights and his cardio held up. But not only that, in the Ramon Tavares fight, he took an ungodly amount of damage. Like, he literally, by the end of the fight, looked like he'd been in a car crash. And yet, he was still able, in terms of volume, to outstrike Ramon Tavares, make the fight very close. I personally still scored the fight for Sidey. The guy is an absolute dog. The guy is an absolute warrior. He's got the heart of a lion. And he's the kind of fighter that you're going to have to kill in order to finish. What I also like about Sidey is that he's relentless. So he's so aggressive on the feet. He applies constant pressure. He throws a really high volume of strikes. He's constantly forcing you to engage. And the first time you experience a fighter like that, it can be jarring. And it's very difficult to train for. You know, when you keep landing your best shots on your opponent, and they just keep coming forward, no matter how much you hurt them, no matter how hard you hit them, they just keep coming forward. For young, inexperienced fighters, it's tough to deal with. I mean, that's demoralizing for anyone, especially for a young, inexperienced fighter like Smotherman. So, in terms of technique, you have to favour Smotherman here, but all the other stuff goes in favour of Sidey. Toughness, durability, cardio, work rate, aggression. And that's not to say that Smotherman can't deal with those threats that Sidey's bringing to the table. We just haven't seen him deal with those challenges that Sidey's bringing to the table to know if Smotherman's battle tested or not. So where you see these guys in the even money odds range, for me, these odds are pretty much where they should be. We can debate if there's a tiny little bit of value on Smotherman as the slight underdog. But for me, both these guys are close to an implied probability of 50%. And if you look at Sidey's odds now, they're up to about, so yeah, 1.75 on average, 59% implied probability. I wouldn't bet Sidey. But if you look at Smotherman's odds, you know, implied probability of 48%, there's not a whole lot of value there. Even if you cap this at 50-50, you're inducing a lot of variance if you take tiny little edges in a sport, like, you know, like MMA, in fights that like this are very difficult to predict. You can find a lot better than this with just a little bit more patience. So in terms of the over-under on this one, we can see that the odds are also split. The odds are also in the even money odds range on this fight to go to a decision or not to go to a decision. And so I actually think this fight's more likely to go to a decision, simply because even though Smotherman isn't battle tested, and even though Sidey is, you know, very aggressive and one of these guys that, you know, will aggressively pursue a finish. If you look at his last sort of 3-4 fights, he is going deep in all of them. So he's gone deep into his last 4 fights. He's got to be tough. He's got to be durable. If you look at Sidey's record, he's gone to a decision in his last 2. All of his finishes inside the distance in recent fights were against quite a low level of opponent. Again, it's difficult to predict the over and under on this one without knowing how Smotherman is going to deal with Sidey if he gets dragged into a dogfight. But either way, I do think it is more likely that this fight will go to a decision. I just wouldn't bet it because there are questions over what to expect from Smotherman. In terms of the most likely outcome for the props, Smotherman by decision I think is most likely outcome. But the odds, I'm guessing, are not great, which they are not. So I would give that a miss. So I hope you found that useful. Break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Jeremy Stephens against Mason Jones. Now, when I first started looking at the fights on this card, Jeremy Stephens was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet. Because you know me, I always say let the odds do the work for you. And straight away the odds felt like they were very wide on this one. So we can see Jeremy Stephens is around a 5.10 underdog, which is plus 410 for an implied probability of 20%. And we can see that Mason Jones is a big favourite at average odds of about 1.18. Which is going to be minus 556 for an implied probability of 85%. So needless to say, there's no way you can bet Mason Jones this weekend at an implied probability of 85%. That is absurd. So as we research this fight, as we analyse this fight, as we break this fight down, the only question we're trying to answer is whether Jeremy Stephens is worth a bet at an implied probability of 20%. So obviously in this breakdown I'm going to explain the reasons why I think this is dog or pass. But one interesting storyline in this fight is that Jeremy Stephens is probably coming into this fight to retire. So he's from Iowa, and this card is obviously taking place in Jeremy Stephens' hometown, home city of Des Moines, Iowa. So there's a bit of a storyline there, something to get Stephens motivated. Now, fighters almost always lose their retirement fight. You look at Anthony Smith this past weekend against Zhang, he got destroyed, he looked terrible. But stylistically, this isn't a terrible matchup for Jeremy Stephens, even though he's a big underdog. So at 38 years old, he's obviously going to be on a steep decline. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to work that out. And if we look at his recent MMA fights in PFL, Stephens hasn't looked good, a shadow of his former self. He's 5'9" with a 71-inch reach. Mason Jones is 30 years old. So that makes him... Sorry, I got a hair in my mouth. There we go. So that makes Mason Jones 8 years younger than Jeremy Stephens. And we know the younger fighter wins close to 70% of the time when there is an 8-year age gap in a fight. So that's a huge trend in Mason Jones' favour. He's 5'10" with a 74-inch reach, which also gives him a bit of a size and reach advantage over Stephens. Now, where do we even begin with this one? So, in terms of how these two match up stylistically, on the feet, they say power's the last thing to go. Jeremy Stephens has shown in his last 3 fights in BKFC that he's still very tough, very durable. At 38, it's not like Stephens' chin has gone. And so, on the feet, Stephens has nasty boxing. And he hits like a truck. He's got true legit knockout power. He's got much tighter technique than Mason Jones when it comes to striking, even at this stage in their careers. Jones on the feet is a bit of a brawler. So where we were talking about guys like Carlos Prates or Santiago Ponzinibbio or Sergey Sidey being fighters that are very aggressive pressure fighters, they come forward and constantly force their opponents to engage. Mason Jones is the same. But because of that, he also tends to take a lot of damage in fights. He's wide open to counters and he gets hit a lot. Jones has amazing cardio. So Jones is the kind of fighter that can sprint hard and force you to engage for 3 rounds, and he's very tough and very durable. However, he does get rocked, wobbled or dropped frequently. We've seen him, eat big shots and get wobbled against both Ludwig Klein and David Onama. And so this is one of those matchups where straight away there is a chance Stephens can knock him out. You don't see guys in their late 30s knock out young hungry bulls all that often, but we've seen Jones get rocked, wobbled, dropped a lot in the past. He's very reckless. So if this fight stays standing, Stevens has got the tighter boxing technique. He's got more power. Jones is great, but he's far worse than Stevens defensively, and he's got nowhere near the power or technique of Stevens. So there's quite an interesting clash of styles on the feet, and if the fight does stay standing, I actually think it could be pretty competitive, pretty close. The big issue with Stevens at this stage in his career, and the biggest area in which he's declined, is that his balance is just off now. So Stevens' takedown defense and ground game has always been an issue for him throughout his career. It was even an issue for him in his prime. But at this later stage in his career, it's even worse. So if you go watch his recent fights in PFL against Miles Price or Nathan Schultz, you will see that he gives up cheap takedowns quite easily, and he's very, very weak off his back. And while Mason Jones isn't the best offensive wrestler, his cardio does enable him to grapple hard and hustle hard on the ground if he wants to. The problem with Mason Jones is that he's a brawler and he doesn't have the best fight IQ. So he quite often chooses to stand and bang against opponents that he has huge advantages against on the ground. And so this is one of those matchups where if Jones comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, he will likely beat Jeremy Stevens easily and dominate. But if he chooses to stand and bang, this one could get dicey for Jones. Like, you know what Bo Nickal said against Paul Craig? I wanted to showcase my striking. If Jones wants to showcase his striking against Jeremy Stevens, could be in a lot of trouble against the hometown guy here. So Stevens is very, 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 very tempting. Very tempting. But it's rare you'll see guys in their late 30s beat guys in their early 30s. So even though there's a nice storyline coming into this one, Jeremy Stevens' return fight in his hometown, we very rarely get happy endings in MMA. And for that reason, with that being said, I'm probably going to pass. But Stevens is a very reluctant pass. And I'm going to be super pissed if he ends up winning, because Jones doesn't have the best fight IQ. He does like to stand and bang a lot in fights where he really shouldn't stand and bang. So in terms of the over-under, it's quite likely this one goes deep. Both are very tough. Both are well-rounded. They're both the kind of guys you have to practically kill in order to finish. Jones has shown in the past how tough and durable he is. Stevens' chin hasn't gone yet, or else I think we would have seen it in his last 3 fights in BKFC. So very likely to go to a decision. I wouldn't bet him myself, but if you want to bet the over-under on this, make watching the fight more interesting. I do think the fight's more likely to go to a decision. And the most likely outcome would be Jones by decision, but the odds are absolutely terrible. So again, you probably want to give that a miss. Break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Jeremy Stevens against Mason Jones. Now, when I first started looking at the fights on this card, Jeremy Stevens was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet. Because you know me, I always say let the odds do the work for you. And straight away the odds felt like they were very wide on this one. So we can see Jeremy Stevens is around a 5.10 underdog, which is plus 410 for an implied probability of 20%. And we can see that Mason Jones is a big favourite at average odds of about 1.18. Which is going to be minus 556 for an implied probability of 85%. So needless to say, there's no way you can bet Mason Jones this weekend at an implied probability of 85%. That is absurd. So as we research this fight, as we analyse this fight, as we break this fight down, the only question we're trying to answer is whether Jeremy Stevens is worth a bet at an implied probability of 20%. So obviously in this breakdown I'm going to explain the reasons why I think this is dog or pass. But one interesting storyline in this fight is that Jeremy Stevens is probably coming into this fight to retire. So he's from Iowa, and this card is obviously taking place in Jeremy Stevens' hometown, home city of Des Moines, Iowa. So there's a bit of a storyline there, something to get Stevens motivated. Now, fighters almost always lose their retirement fight. You look at Anthony Smith this past weekend against Zhang. He got destroyed. He looked terrible. But stylistically, this isn't a terrible matchup for Jeremy Stephens, even though he's a big underdog. So at 38 years old, he's obviously going to be on a steep decline. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to work that out. And if we look at his recent MMA fights in PFL, Stephens hasn't looked good. A shadow of his former self. He's 5'9" with a 71-inch reach. Mason Jones is 30 years old. So that makes him... Sorry, I got a hair in my mouth. There we go. So that makes Mason Jones 8 years younger than Jeremy Stephens. And we know the younger fighter wins close to 70% of the time when there is an 8-year age gap in a fight. So that's a huge trend in Mason Jones' favour. He's 5'10" with a 74-inch reach, which also gives him a bit of a size and reach advantage over Stephens. Now, where do we even begin with this one? So, in terms of how these two match up stylistically, on the feet, they say power's the last thing to go. Jeremy Stephens has shown in his last 3 fights in BKFC that he's still very tough, very durable. At 38, it's not like Stephens' chin has gone. And so, on the feet, Stephens has nasty boxing. And he hits like a truck. He's got true legit knockout power. He's got much tighter technique than Mason Jones when it comes to striking, even at this stage in their careers. Jones on the feet is a bit of a brawler. So where we were talking about guys like Carlos Prates or Santiago Ponzinibbio or Sergey Sidey being fighters that are very aggressive pressure fighters, they come forward and constantly force their opponents to engage. Mason Jones is the same. But because of that, he also tends to take a lot of damage in fights. He's wide open to counters and he gets hit a lot. Jones has amazing cardio. So Jones is the kind of fighter that can sprint hard and force you to engage for 3 rounds, and he's very tough and very durable. However, he does get rocked, wobbled or dropped frequently. We've seen him, eat big shots and get wobbled against both Ludwig Klein and David Onama. And so this is one of those matchups where straight away there is a chance Stephens can knock him out. You don't see guys in their late 30s knock out young hungry bulls all that often, but we've seen Jones get rocked, wobbled, dropped a lot in the past. He's very reckless. So if this fight stays standing, Stephens has got the tighter boxing technique. He's got more power. Jones is great, but he's far worse than Stephens defensively, and he's got nowhere near the power or technique of Stephens. So there's quite an interesting clash of styles on the feet, and if the fight does stay standing, I actually think it could be pretty competitive, pretty close. The big issue with Stephens at this stage in his career, and the biggest area in which he's declined, is that his balance is just off now. So Stephens' takedown defense and ground game has always been an issue for him throughout his career. It was even an issue for him in his prime. But at this later stage in his career, it's even worse. So if you go watch his recent fights in PFL against Miles Price or Nathan Schultz, you will see that he gives up cheap takedowns quite easily, and he's very, very weak off his back. And while Mason Jones isn't the best offensive wrestler, his cardio does enable him to grapple hard and hustle hard on the ground if he wants to. The problem with Mason Jones is that he's a brawler and he doesn't have the best fight IQ. So he quite often chooses to stand and bang against opponents that he has huge advantages against on the ground. And so this is one of those matchups where if Jones comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, he will likely beat Jeremy Stephens easily and dominate. But if he chooses to stand and bang, this one could get dicey for Jones. Like, you know what Bo Nickal said against Paul Craig? I wanted to showcase my striking. If Jones wants to showcase his striking against Jeremy Stephens, could be in a lot of trouble against the hometown guy here. So Stephens is very, 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 very tempting. Very tempting. But it's rare you'll see guys in their late 30s beat guys in their early 30s. So even though there's a nice storyline coming into this one. Jeremy Stephens' return fight in his hometown. We very rarely get happy endings in MMA. And for that reason, with that being said, I'm probably going to pass. But Stephens is a very reluctant pass. And I'm going to be super pissed if he ends up winning, because Jones doesn't have the best fight IQ. He does like to stand and bang a lot in fights where he really shouldn't stand and bang. So in terms of the over-under, it's quite likely this one goes deep. Both are very tough. Both are well-rounded. They're both the kind of guys you have to practically kill in order to finish. Jones has shown in the past how tough and durable he is. Stephens' chin hasn't gone yet, or else I think we would have seen it in his last 3 fights in BKFC. So very likely to go to a decision. I wouldn't bet it myself, but if you want to bet the over-under on this, make watching the fight more interesting. I do think the fight's more likely to go to a decision. And the most likely outcome would be Jones by decision, but the odds are absolutely terrible. So again, you probably want to give that a miss. So I hope you found those breakdowns useful. I'll be dropping another video later on this week with some more picks for the prelims. Please hit the like button if you haven't already. Subscribe if you haven't already. It would mean a lot. Check out my website, mabettingtips.com, link in the description below. So have a great week. I hope you crush it this weekend and make a lot of money. Hopefully Nickal, Sandhagen come through for us if you decide to take them. Take care everyone. Love you all. Nice one guys. Bye.